America was swept by a wave of crime. Almost every day, new shocking footage of large-scale robberies of shops and shopping centers appears. Recently, the Central Nordstrom department store was demolished in Los Angeles. 50 robbers in balaclavas robbed $100,000 worth of branded goods from Burberry, Yves Saint Laurent and Bottega Veneta in a few minutes and then fled in expensive stolen cars. This is far from an isolated case. Boutiques and stores throughout America are robbed in a similar way, although most often this happens in California. In the city of Oakland near San Francisco, the local police are already in all seriousness offering business owners to buy horns and actively honking them at the time of the robbery, trying to scare off criminals. Supermarkets in Washington, D.C., have begun to remove products from brands like Colgate because they are constantly being stolen. In other stores, many goods are simply placed in counters under lock and key, trying to save themselves from robbery. In San Francisco, the actions of the owners of one of the 7-Eleven outlets, who rushed to beat the robber, caused a great resonance. He did not pay anything for this, but the owners are threatened with a criminal case for battery. These anecdotal examples are indicative of the general deplorable situation of the rise in violent crime in the United States, the prerequisites for which have been forming for many years, and have now reached a boiling point. Throughout the history of the United States, periods of relative internal stability with the dominance of the doctrine of law and order were periodically replaced by epochs of chaos and rampant lawlessness. For example, during the Great Depression, street gangs and the Italian mafia seemed all-powerful. Later, some of them were destroyed, others were put under the control of the special services. From the early 1970s, against the backdrop of turbulent events with the anti-war movement and the struggle for civil rights, the crime rate began to rise rapidly again. It peaked at the turn of the 80s and 90s. It is not for nothing that this period became the golden era of crime action movies and thrillers in Hollywood. The number of murders and other violent crimes then was off the charts. Racial contradictions escalated to the limit. It all culminated in a riot in Los Angeles in 1992, sparked by a police beating of a black man named Rodney King. For 6 days, people from the ghetto smashed the entire city. Hundreds of houses were burned, 50 people were killed, and the amount of damage reached $1 billion. In terms of dynamics, the pogroms of that time even surpassed the BLM riots of 2020, although they took place in only one city. The American system reacted to this by sharply tightening the screws. Already in 1994, a new criminal code was adopted, one of the co-authors of which was the current U.S. President Joe Biden, although he does not like to remember it. Punishment for all crimes was sharply toughened, and the number of criminal articles allowing bail or a suspended sentence was greatly reduced. The so-called theory of broken windows has become widely known. It says, it is better to punish severely even for minor offenses, which will eventually minimize the number of serious crimes. This strategy was actively used in New York and other U.S. megacities, which significantly reduced the crime rate. However, this phenomenon had a downside: the explosive growth of the prison population. If in the early 1980s 500,000 Americans were behind bars, then by the mid-90s their number reached 1.5 million. And by the mid-noughties, there were already 2.5 million. By that time, the United States had become the absolute record holder in the world for the number of prisoners. It was extremely difficult to get out of this criminal environment once you got into it. But this stopped the growth of crime. The number of murders, rapes, and robberies in America gradually decreased throughout the late 90s, all of the 2000s, and the first half of the 2010s. However, this favorable trend was reversed in 2015. Since Barack Obama came to power, the Democrats began to increasingly promote the topic of law enforcement reform with its subsequent liberalization. This was especially facilitated by the scandals with the death of blacks at the hands of the police. After one of them, in 2012, the BLM movement emerged. It held mass demonstrations in Florida, and then began to organize quite serious pogroms, first in St. Louis, and then in Baltimore. Under pressure from BLM activists, the police began to ban various previously popular practices such as stop and frisk, stops for the purpose of inspection without explanation. Police became afraid of accusations of racism and traveled less to areas inhabited by African Americans and migrants, which instantly increased the crime rate. Donald Trump's coming to power did not radically change the situation. On the contrary, although he was a Republican, he also supported the liberalization of the criminal code for a long time, trying to please African Americans and enlist their support. But it was radical upheavals that happened against the backdrop of the BLM pogroms in the summer of 2020. Then the Democrats in many megacities began to reduce the police with populist measures, and the main slogan was, defund the police, to cut off funding for the police. In addition, in the wake of BLM, very liberal prosecutors were elected, who began to promote their vision of law enforcement. For example, a new wave of prosecutors has decided to simply abandon the fight against many crimes, such as robberies, on the pretext that they are committed by oppressed members of minorities who need help. For example, in the U.S. capital city of Washington in 2022, 2/3 of all arrests went without charges. The police will arrest someone for theft, robbery, or car theft and release them after 72 hours. In California, all thefts up to $950 have been officially decriminalized. Therefore, the police completely stopped fighting robberies, knowing that the criminals would be released anyway. And we have long been talking about not banal shopping, but about well-organized raids on expensive clothing, jewelry, watch or equipment stores, which are then taken to neighboring states and sold through the darknet. The number of car thefts in 2022 in the United States reached a record 1 million. But the worst thing is with murders. In 2 years, 2020 and 2021, the number of murders increased by 44% at once. Moreover, the level of crime detection has fallen sharply. For example, in homicides, the police are now able to find criminals in less than half of the cases. And the weekly reports from some Chicago with hundreds of wounded in street shootings and dozens killed resemble news from the front. The rise in crime forced the authorities of many American cities to sharply back down and tried to return to the doctrine of law and order. But it was not the case, because irreparable damage to the system had already been done. In many megacities, there is an acute shortage of police officers after so many years of public defamation. They simply do not want to go to work. The Austin police chief in Texas was recently forced to resign, unable to perform duties due to understaffing of the police. The processes of criminalization of America are far from happening on their own. The same liberal prosecutors were elected with the money of the Soros Foundation. And it is he, as well as other sponsors of the Democratic Party, who can become the beneficiary of what is happening. For example, waiting for the collapse of the real estate market in large cities due to the growth of crime, in order to invest in it profitably. There are also longer-term strategic goals. After all, now in the United States, the strategy of controlled chaos is being implemented one-to-one, which was previously used only in other countries. For example, prosecutors who refuse to fight crime are now actively trying to imprison opponents of the Democratic Party in the person of Trump and his supporters. Sooner or later, the U.S. population, tired of crime and lawlessness, will want a strong hand. Then it will be possible to sharply tighten the screws and begin, for example, the mass confiscation of weapons from Americans, which the Democrats have long been striving for. However, there is one flaw in this regard. Chaos is chaos because it can unexpectedly get out of control. So far, the elites have been able to carry out a large-scale social experiment in the liberal restructuring of America quite effectively. But at one point, this can lead to such serious shocks for the United States that the very existence of this country will already be in question.